Hi, everyone. Hey, Angus, would you like to join us? EWB Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and all the places that people are dialing in from today. Perhaps actually you might like to pop in the chat the land from where you're dialing in from, and then we can pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. We respect their stories, wisdom and knowledge systems and their ongoing deep connection to land, water and community. Let's have a little look and see where people are dialing in from. A couple. Yep, so Gadigal. Oh gosh, it's all coming through quite quick and fast, isn't it? Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. I'm your host today. I'm just going to be providing a little bit of context before I hand over to Angus, who's going to do a presentation with a little bit of time for questions at the end. Today's a special day, and thanks so much for celebrating with us. I hope you've got a little cuppa in your hand. It's Friday afternoon. Hope you're dry, hope you're well. It is the World Engineering Day for Sustainable Development. We just say WED behind the scenes. It's a fairly new day. It only started in 2019. And this is a little bit exciting because this event is a part of a global live series of events right around the world. So welcome to anyone who's joined us from overseas as well. Also on this day, it's doubly excited for EWB because we launched our 4th episode of the Action Is podcast. We have Jane McMaster being interviewed by our very own Mitch Horrocks, and you can head over to our website, which is EWB/podcast, to pick up that latest episode. Also, there's an amazing one, which was our first ever episode. And we had Marlene Kanga on there. And for those of you that weren't aware, Marlene was instrumental in championing this day and getting it over the line. So I'm going to hand over to Angus. Angus is a mechatronic engineer with a range of experience in startups, research, and as an EWB field professional. Angus has been volunteering and working with EWB for almost 8 years. As a technology development lead, Angus works collaboratively with communities to develop sustainable, appropriate technology solutions. And Angus is also undertaking research at ANU looking into decolonising engineering practices. Over to you, Angus.
Thanks so much, Mel, for the introduction. Yeah, really excited to be joining you all today, and such an honor to be speaking on behalf of EWB. There's so much amazing work that EWB does, and yeah, I'm very excited to share a little part of that in what I've been up to recently. So firstly, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm zooming in from. That's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that they continue to look after culture, country and people, and also acknowledge that we have a lot to learn about engineering and about sustainability from the world's oldest continuing culture, who inhabit the driest inhabited continent on the planet. It's been awesome to see acknowledgements to country become kind of so ubiquitous in the last few years, especially kind of in this online environment. While these are really awesome to see, sometimes it's confusing and a little bit jarring about what is the relevance of that acknowledgement to the content of it's being presented, and how can we incorporate some elements of and respect for those cultures into our work. And hopefully this presentation today will go into a little bit of how we've started to, how that might be possible through engineering, and trying to enact that. So yeah, those images just there are a Ngambri custodian here in Canberra, kind of making a scarred tree, which are some of the kind of artifacts you see kind of around country sometimes. And it's, yeah, I suppose to emphasize that these practices are ongoing, and in many places they're increasingly being rejuvenated, which is really exciting to see. So as many of you know, EWB has a presence kind of in Vanuatu, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, where we're permanently, we've got permanent staff located who are practicing engineering for sustainable development, and they're doing some amazing work. We also have work that we do here in Australia, which kind of falls under this umbrella of engineering on country. Within that, there's so much amazing work that's happening. And today I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few of the projects that I'm involved with inside of that, and how we're engineering towards sustainable development here in Australia. But to start off, just a little bit of development 101. So despite that, we have this great set of sustainable development goals that many countries around the world have agreed that we need to prioritize and work towards, there still isn't, you know, a universal, ubiquitous definition of sustainability or of sustainable engineering. It's contested, it's messy, and it's really challenging. At EWB, we're trying to embrace that ambiguity. We believe that sustainable development needs to be defined and enacted locally with the underserved and under-resourced communities who have historically been impacted most. So development thinkers, activists, practitioners are increasingly finding that when we're deploying technologies, that these need to be really locally embedded, and communities need to be given a voice around their differing ideas around sustainability, around life, when we're considering the introduction of new technologies or systems. So we need technology and systems that really serve a diverse range of communities. To get there, we need an engineering practice that is able to collaborate with a really diverse range of communities. So today I'm going to be talking about our technology development approach. So that's the whole set of tools that we use and systems that we use to work collaboratively with communities. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how those are kind of playing out in the First Nations space in Australia. So firstly, before I delve deep into our approach, it's important to note, like, what is an approach? Approach just means the way that we work as engineers. So as you can see here, like I've drawn out some of the key parts of what an approach is. So that might be the tools and techniques that you use when you're designing something. It might be the principles that you hold close to your heart when you're doing so. It might be the process that you follow as you're kind of moving through time in that project. And it also might be the way in which you collaborate with other people in the project, whether they're community members or other engineers. So the approach that we use as engineers plays a really strong role in what the outcome is, what technology that we develop or the system that we deliver. The values that we embody through the approach are unconsciously or consciously embedded in the final technologies that we deliver. So to draw attention to that, like, even if you don't think that you're aware of what kind of technology development approach you're using, here's some examples of kind of ones. If you're trained as an engineer, you might be familiar with. One is the kind of the V model around figuring out what system requirements, and then kind of implementing and kind of seeing how well our project measures against those. The other one is, I studied engineering, and many of us study engineering, and the six-step approach might be familiar to you, around kind of having your givens and assumptions and working through things in a linear way to come to a solution. I'm going to now talk about our approach, and yeah, hopefully you can see how it is able to work more closely with communities to kind of address their notions of sustainability and their notions of what a good life is. So first part of that approach, as I said, is a process. This is really like core to our approach. It's really handy to have a process that you can kind of work through when you're doing a project. Yeah. So I won't go into too much detail in this, but basically you can see on like the top side of that, we have what we call the enabling environment. And so that's part of the process that takes us through thinking around what are the non-technical aspects of the project work we're working on that are going to enable the technical aspects to work. On the bottom, we have the typical technology design cycle that many of you might have seen before, which includes kind of a double diamond. I like to call it the roller coaster because it's a roller coaster of kind of ideas and innovation. Yeah, it's important to point out that our process also includes kind of looking at pilot, and scale up because we really want to be making sure that these innovations both impact locally, but then also can scale up to have more larger scale and distributed impact. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these later. So if it doesn't all make sense right now, that's okay too. The other part of kind of what makes up our approach is our principles. And so we've tried to be explicit about those through this list. Again, there's a lot of those, so I'll work a little bit later to kind of draw out what are some principles that I've found really useful in some of the projects and how they kind of play out. The other one is this kind of collaboration styles. That's really some terms that you may have heard of before when you're thinking about design with communities. So like human-centered design or co-design, community-led design. These are all different collaboration styles we can use in different contexts where it's appropriate. Sometimes it will be the best idea to go for a human-centered design approach. Sometimes it's more appropriate to go for the community-led approach, depending on the context. So the first project that I will talk a little bit about is the solar trailer project, or the portable energy system. So to set up the context for this is that the portable energy system or solar trailer project is in collaboration with the Centre for Appropriate Technology. So they are an Indigenous led organisation who are developing and delivering technology with really remote Indigenous communities in Australia. They're based in Alice Springs. And they have a long history of working with Indigenous communities. The user group for this technology are Indigenous rangers. So Indigenous rangers use traditional Aboriginal land management practices along with Western scientific methods to, among other things, manage pests, fire, and ultimately deliver ecosystem resilience and significant carbon sequestration benefits across a vast area of Australia. So as you can see in that little map there, they're just some of the Indigenous protected areas that exist. And then those pins are just some of the Indigenous ranger programs that exist. On top of that, which it doesn't show, is that just about over half of Australia is actually subject to native title claims. This means that the majority of Australia is owned to some extent and is potentially can be managed by traditional land management practices. So a report commissioned by the Federal Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet found that Indigenous sea and land managers deliver $3 worth of environmental, social, economic value for every $1 spent. So it's a highly effective way supporting Indigenous rangers to ensure that there's flow-on benefits for the whole of Australia in terms of environmental protection and fighting climate change, as well as the flow-on benefits to Indigenous communities, including reported to include like the role models, better mental health, physical health, strengthening of culture, and women's empowerment. So the challenge with Indigenous rangers, for some Indigenous rangers, is that they would like to access renewable energy while working across a variety of sites in some really remote parts of Australia. This would give them access to refrigeration, lighting, cooling, and just generally assisting the rangering work that they do through access to power tools and other electrical products. So yeah, I'm just going to go through now our process and kind of show how it's been used at every different stage through the development of this project. Hopefully that will give you a little bit of an understanding about how our process works, but also a little bit of understanding about how the project is going and what we're hoping to deliver. So during the kind of the background to this project, we've formed this partnership with the Centre for Appropriate Technology. That is really, sorry, I'll go back. So strategy and planning stage of our process is really about figuring out like what is an appropriate and what is a strategic area to work in. We've decided that based on a lot of the things I've been saying before today, that working in Indigenous Australia is really important, both to serve the communities that are underserved, but also all those other co-benefits that I've listed just before. And so the partnership with the Centre for Appropriate Technology really falls out of that space, in that they are a really great organisation, delivering some amazing impact, and it could be really impactful if they were able to access some of the skills and knowledge and resources that EWB has to bring on board. So that's really, this stage is really about conceptualizing the project and thinking about things more strategically and systematically. That list there is just a list of a few, those images, a list of a few organizations who have kind of expressed support for the project during the early stages. Then there's this kind of pre-design stage. So to quickly go to both pre-design and conceptual design, they're both aimed really at coming out, deciding what the thing that we're designing is. So in pre-design, we're trying to figure out what challenge are we trying to address with the people who we're working with, the communities we're working with. In this pre-design stage, we involved a number of visits up to the top end to Cape York, where we worked with Andre from the Centre of Appropriate Technology to kind of scope and figure out what issues were for people, for Indigenous rangers and remote communities in those areas. And so through that part of the process, which is a whole many months and few years actually, it was determined that kind of access to power is a really important aspect of Indigenous rangering. So as you can see, there's an image of a Indigenous, like a ranger station there that was taken during one of the scoping trips. That has a fixed solar installation, which is awesome. But the installation of some of these solar remote systems in remote stations and remote communities can be from $200,000 to $250,000 for one station. So it's a prohibitively expensive exercise to install power on every single station that rangers might be visiting in a particular season or over a range of seasons. So now I'm just going to go to conceptual design. So we figured that we want to work kind of in that domain because that's really important to the people who we're working with. This next slide kind of talks to the ideate stage of the conceptual design stage, as you can see up here. So ideate is really around kind of generating a large number of good ideas to address that problem. we did that actually throughout the EWB challenge, which is a first year engineering education program where first year undergraduate engineers kind of learn about challenges in engineering and approaches, human-centered approaches in engineering. And so the scoping that was done during the pre-design was used as a context for those students. This was really great because as technical professionals, we have a lot of knowledge and we have a lot of skills, but there can be also things that we miss, actually having kind of a bias or a build-up of what's possible and what's not. So it's really great to have fresh minds, generate a range of ideas, given that really specific brief that we were able to give them. We were able to kind of combine that with some of our own research about what technology exists, and come up with a wide range of technology ideas that could address this issue. So as you can see, we've got everything from solar powered trailers. We've got solar that sits on top of a Land Cruiser that Indigenous rangers take out, and a whole range of other things. So then the second half of conceptual design is really decide like what concept is appropriate. And this is really working closely with people who have really good contextual knowledge to be able to filter down what makes sense and what doesn't in that context. I won't talk too much about that, but as you can see, there's a lot of rating things against different criteria, widely consulting with different stakeholders. And yeah, finally, that takes us to having like a final idea of what we actually want to create. I'll just stop there and just say that this stage is really, up until this stage is really important to pause and see that as engineers, we often jump to this stage. When I get introduced to a context or a project, because I've been trained technically, it's very easy to jump straight to thinking about what concept we want to do, what idea is going to address this problem, and into a stage of kind of designing the nuts and bolts of that. The first, those kind of pre-designing conceptual design stages are really designed to slow us down during that stage and really consult widely, put our creative hats on, and really explore the context more fully so we can really make a collective and a more informed and wise decision about what we're deciding to do and being very intentional. So the next stage is this kind of detailed design stage. This is what we typically trained in as engineers, when it's the part that we typically tend to be good at. So this is around developing a design, producing a prototype, and then validating that prototype against the requirements that the communities have expressed to us in the earlier stages. So while it is traditional nuts and bolts engineering, it is also really embedded in like what communities want on the ground, which is really important. So we've come up with this design. It's basically incorporates a lot of elements from what exists already, and a small number of novel elements, and a lot of elements also from what students were able to come up with during the design challenge, which is really exciting. As you can see, it's this kind of solution that is able to fold up and fold down when rangers get to their site, and provides enough energy that they can do all their essential things. And it has enough battery capacity that if they are unable to set it up, or if there is a rainy day, they're still able to effectively use power out on country. The last stage of this process is where we haven't got to yet. So we're currently actually fabricating the prototype, but this is pilot. And so it's all about, the pilot is all about figuring out if the technology actually makes sense in the context that we want to deploy it in. In this case, it means looking at some really cool organizations, like especially I really love the work of Country Needs People, and if you're looking for more resources on Indigenous ranges. They're a really good place to search. But yeah, looking to a wide range of stakeholders again to validate that this is an impactful technology, and then figure out what models we can use to scale that technology up to get to more ranger groups. So whether that is a social enterprise model where an Indigenous organization is manufacturing these technologies and creating opportunities and skills within the Indigenous community, or whether that is doing a kind of a service or lease model to ranger groups who are paid for the environmental services, or another model might be land councils purchasing solar trailers through their the income that they get from native title claims and settlements. So yeah, that's one's really figuring about how we're going to get this impact from just up and the impact up from one single trailer out on country to get it to every ranger group who would like one. So the next project I'm going to talk about is something that happened very recently under the label of the Local Design Summit. So some of you might be familiar with EWB design summits. They're basically events where people can come, students most often can come to one of the locations that EWB works overseas and learn about sustainable development, learn about human-centered engineering, human-centered design, and our approach in those contexts. And it's often quite a transformational opportunity for students and professionals who undertake these, because they get to work directly with communities. So we ran in the local ACT chapter of EWB, ran a local design summit, which was based on here in Ngambri and Ngunnawal country. This is the first time that we've tried something of this nature, but it was amazing to see some of the results and some of the transformations of students. These projects, while they are educational experiences, they are also technology design events, and often kind of either start the kind of pre-design or scoping, as we said before, phase of a technology design project. And that's what's happened here with the Local Design Summit. So this summit was held over 1 week in mid-February, where we engaged with a local farmer, Murray, who owns a farm called Nuru Farm. Murray is collaborating with Ngambri, Woogaloo, Wiradjuri custodian House to figure out how he can increase the sustainability of his farm through the use of Indigenous land management practices. We also engage with a native seed expert, who you can see in some of those photos in the khaki shirt, whose name is Dan Ganter. He's a Gungri man and has over 30 years of experience in the harvesting of native grasses as a business, and has a whole wealth of knowledge about the use of traditional plants and sustainable livelihoods on country. So yeah, to give you a little bit more of a context about native grasses and kind of on-country Indigenous agricultural enterprises. Sorry, I've left out the quote there, but basically native grasses are everywhere in Australia. Some people seem to think that that native grasses are a rare or a kind of a partial thing in the Australian landscape, but from Murray's estimation, the farm who we're working with, native grasses make up some 60+% of most grazier properties across southeastern Australia. So native grasses can provide all these different benefits. They restore carbon to the soil through their deep-rooted perennial plant systems. Some farmers are able to generate carbon credits and biodiversity credits from the presence of native grasses and native ecosystems on their farms. The livestock absolutely love native grasses. That's one of the reasons why there aren't 100% coverage of native grasses, is because livestock eat them as soon as they can. The other benefit of native grasses is that they can be sold for food, or they can be sold for revegetation. So for farmers, there are a lot of benefits of native grasses. The key focus of this local design summit was, how can we make sure Indigenous people are benefiting in the enterprises on country to do with their traditional livelihoods of native grasses and native plants. So this design summit actually yielded some really amazing ideas. We had 3 groups, and one of them came up with this idea of a machine that could help Dan process seed when he's collecting a whole variety of seed in all of the different locations that he travels to on country. So the design they came up with was this portable seed cleaning device that basically you can chuck all your seeds in and then use the power of kind of vibration and some pretty high-tech materials to sort the different seeds based on their mechanical properties and size. This is an idea that I suppose the clients for that project, Dan and Warren, were really, really taken by. So since then it has been designed up in CAD and currently it's being prototyped, and will kind of continue on that process that you're all now familiar with of the technology development approach, technology development process of kind of detailed design and then piloting. Yeah. So instead of kind of going through that process again through you with this project, I'll talk a little bit about some of the guiding principles that I found really useful in approaching this project and in this context. So one that has been really useful is like a strength-based approach. This one sits over, for me, it sits over all of the work that I do, especially in the First Nations space. I think often the way that we're taught to think about Indigenous people and culture is in a deficit-based model, where we're thinking about all of the negative impacts of colonization and of dispossession from land that Indigenous people continue to experience, such as lower literacy levels, family violence, drug and alcohol problems, and a whole other suite of issues. Looking through a strength-based lens means we look at what Indigenous people and Indigenous culture and knowledge systems have as a strength. And really that strength is sustainability. It is managing complexity. It's knowing how to live on this country successfully for tens of thousands of years and through dramatic kind of climate change that has occurred over that time. So while it is important to not ignore the issues and the deficits through kind of a toxic positive lens of there aren't any issues, solutions are always going to start with the strengths of communities. And in this case, that's definitely true. So yeah, working from a strengths-based approach, we can build on and work with Indigenous knowledge, with Indigenous people, to provide solutions that continue that knowledge into the future and make it celebrated. And yeah. Another guiding principle that is been really important in thinking about this project is systems thinking. It's the whole space of Indigenous agriculture and livelihoods on country is very, very complicated and systematic issue. It's not just about a technology it's not just about a system that we need to implement to solve a particular issue. It's a complex web of interactions and issues, and yeah, it's kind of about access to land, it's about culture, it's about markets, it's about climate change. It is also about technology, but it's also about cross-cultural interactions. It's really complicated. And by kind of acknowledging and embracing that complexity and that systems thinking, we can make sure that we kind of acknowledge and honor the complexity of the situation and act accordingly, rather than having a reductionist view that only addresses a small part of the problem and causes a whole range of unintended consequences, which I think is sometimes all too common in some of the engineering that we practice. The final one that I found really useful is just thinking about impacts, not outputs. So this is in this project, it's not about making sure that we can eat native foods again, or it's not about making sure that that Indigenous people get money for being on country and doing traditional cultural work. It's not even about the monetary income that they can make. It's really about the well-being of the people who are the users of the technology, who are impacted by the technology, the people who we're trying to improve the lives of. It's really about that. So that impacts the projects in all kinds of ways. But for me, it primarily at this stage impacts us to think, it encourages us to think about what impact looks like for the communities we're working with, and very intentionally going into those communities and having a really slow and really conscious yarn about what a good life looks like before we start getting into all of the nitty-gritty around how many liters per minute of seed does this machine need to produce, or what is your desired income level from a livelihood on country. It's really about what makes us happy and healthy and sustainable as a society, first and foremost. Yeah, that's all I have to say to everyone today. I hope that made sense and was clear. I hope also that it's kind of spurred some thoughts and inspiration and questions about how we can kind of build back better, but also build back wiser, and about the role that engineers have in sustainable development. Thank you.
Thanks, Angus. We've got a few questions that have come through. Most of them are anonymous, and that's fine. We've got one from David Hood, and we'll get to that one because I think that could be one of the shorter ones. But one of the ones that I liked, I mean, they were all fantastic, but I'll just read this one out. Really enjoying the presentation. Thanks, Angus. Do you think that engineers have the communication skills and cultural awareness needed to ensure that they are listening to community and not influencing community during the consultation phase?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. My experience spans a little bit of working in industry, a little bit of working in research. So I might be a little bit biased, but I'd say that we do totally. I think that I've definitely come across engineers who don't, but I think that just shows that we need better education, and we need better, we need better knowledge as a sector about how to deal with this. But also it's giving me a lot of hope talking to a lot of amazing engineers who I come across all the time. But yeah, that's a highly important thing about whether we actually have the ability to listen early on in consultative stages of design.
Thanks, Angus. Okay, another question. How do you know when to use a broad lens to solution possibilities and when to use a focus lens to be very specific with what the solution could be?
Yes, that is really hard. And that, I suppose, is what the process is trying to achieve. So where you see the process kind of come in from a narrow point and kind of get wider, that's saying that we want to have that broad lens. It could like divergent thinking. I always get confused between divergent and convergent. And then when you see it kind of narrow down again, that's when we want to get convergent and narrow in. So that process really helps us in the design project to do that. It guides us to do that. It demands that we do that, because otherwise we don't. It's important to note that even though the process does help do that, obviously it's not everything, and we're going to have to apply that in our own way as practitioners. That really just requires a lot of reflexivity and insight and thinking, and sitting down with communities too. But yeah, the process gives us at least a scaffold to start of when to think divergently and when to think convergently.
So another question coming from a different perspective this time: what sort of knowledge or baseline capacity do our community partners need to have to participate in these technology development methods?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that the community partners and communities need to be familiar with the aims that we have in working this way. I've come across a lot of organizations and individuals who expect me or EWB to act as a kind of a contractor in the technical phase of a design project. Whereas where we're coming from is that the technical design needs to be really thoroughly integrated into all those other parts of the design project, and how success is defined and everything. So they do need to be on board. I don't think that they need a lot of training necessarily, but it's a discussion that needs to happen early on in the development of partnerships. Totally. Hope that answers the question. It is a tricky one.
With respect to David's question, I've seen that Kim has highlighted that one of our community partners, CFAT, is actually working in the space sector, but I might just unmic David and see allowed to talk. David, was there anything further that you wanted to ask with respect to your question?
Unmute. Go on now. Unmute. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, it's just that in this space innovation challenge that we're working on with schools and universities, we want to try and get a First Nations involvement in it, and we're talking about how they might, what sort of imagery do they have of the sky above and space and their culture, and how we can bring that into the challenge. But would something like data coming from space on land use and climate observations assist them? And I'm just thinking, where's Angus working in that area? How far up into the space high technology area is he going?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, a great motivation to bring in an Indigenous lens in the space that you're working. So the work that I'm aware of so far of in that space, I'm sure there's a lot, but there are the use of remote imaging or satellite imagery that is used to augment the capabilities of Indigenous rangers in terms of fire prediction and fire management. That's an ongoing piece of work. That is done through some really cool things like augmented reality and virtual reality, which is exciting to see. There is also, I know plenty of kind of people in this space who are really excited about the potentials of remote monitoring and mapping technologies for assisting land management. On the other side, in terms of how Indigenous thinking or protocols could influence the space work, there is a really great set of work coming out of Australia in terms of Indigenous protocols for artificial intelligence. So using Indigenous methodologies and protocols to think through and then build systems of artificial intelligence that have different characteristics from what we've developed in the West. So that's something you could also look at.
Great. Thanks, Angus.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We'll pop you on mute. So there's a question that's just come through. It might be the last one, I guess we'll see, but certainly if people have any more questions, put them in the Q&A. And I did ask Angus before this if he had capacity to answer the questions that perhaps we wouldn't get to. So still time for you to pop your question in the Q&A. But this one says, fantastic presentation. Indigenous knowledge sounds really interesting, but how is it relevant for addressing modern problems like human-induced climate change?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think that that Indigenous knowledge in this space and what I'm talking about, it's not like that's 100% of the solution. The solutions that we're hoping to build when we're building back wiser or building back better are an integration of Indigenous knowledge and I suppose new modern knowledge from the Western world. Some Indigenous thinkers refer this to like the third archive. It's basically, yeah, a seamless integration of both and the benefits of both. And it's really important to acknowledge that Indigenous people in Australia have actually lived through a period of quite rapid and dramatic climate change. So about 20,000 years ago, we had an ice age. And so, yeah, often you hear this idea of that the sea level is a lot higher now than it used to be. And that's the crazy thing about that, is that Indigenous people were here when the sea level was lower and have knowledge about the topography and the features of landscape that's now underwater. So that really demonstrates a continuous robust knowledge and kind of culture over that whole period, which is really cool. So I think we do have a lot to learn in terms of sustainability and adaptation from Indigenous knowledge. And yeah, and then there's a lot of exciting property potentials for combining that with new knowledge to develop, yeah, better systems for the future.
Thanks, Angus. Well, I think that brings us to a close on the Q&A. Did you have any final reflections? I think you were going to say something about sustainable engineering, perhaps?
Totally, yeah. I'll just say that Build Back Wiser at its heart is kind of what we're doing today, is a call to action for all engineers to bring greater foresight into their work. To put that simply, we want a future that mitigates against and overcomes today's most critical challenges: the climate crisis, gender inequity, poverty, all these really weird problems. They're impossible to achieve, to surpass, to overcome without sustainable engineering. So if you want to learn more about engineers and how we can make sustainable difference for people on the planet, just follow us on the link that we're going to post there in the chat. It's just sustainable engineering updates on the Engineers Without Borders website.
Awesome. That's it for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will be putting this presentation on our YouTube channel. That's it. Have a really beautiful Friday. Listen to our podcast and we'll see you next time. Bye.